The metallic snip of Japanese steel shears shouldn't have been louder than the rhythmic surge of the Busan tide against the pier. Yet Graves felt every click like a gunshot as she adjusted the charcoal gray lapel of the man they called the iron anchor. Her hands remained steady, a survival trait she'd perfected while building an elite atelier where the cost of a misplaced stitch wasn't a refund, but a shallow grave in the harbor. Chairman Shin Tae-O sat on the fitting pedestal, a predator draped in bespoke silk. He was a man of calculated silence who noticed a lie as easily as a frayed thread. Even the molecules in the shop reorganized when he arrived, an instinctive deference to power that stilled every tongue. Graves had earned the right to stand this close through sheer technical obsession, knowing Tae-O required his jackets cut with aggressive precision to hide the 9mm at his hip. But today, Graves wasn't aiming for perfection. She was aiming for a warning. The salt-heavy humidity of the Busan docks seeped through the vents, making the shop feel both like a sanctuary and a tomb. Thursday nights were for the chairman's final fitting, a ritual of silent nods until Graves' knuckles brushed the underside of the left lapel. She felt it, a microscopic electronic hum. A federal wire, hidden in the very garment she was perfecting. Graves registered the bodyguard by the door. The man was too still, his focus on the chairman's throat rather than the exit. Her breath hitched, the arctic air of the atelier turning to ice. For the first time in 3 years, she allowed a deliberate mistake. She drove a silver pin deep into the charcoal fabric, grazing the chairman's skin. As she bowed in a feigned apology, her fingers tucked a hand-torn scrap of measuring tape into the hidden seam. On it, written in urgent ink, was the death warrant: "Your bodyguard is wearing a wire. Exit now." Tae-O's eyes, cold like the harbor depths, flicked to Graves. No emotion broke his mask, only a lethal tightening of his jaw as his thumb pressed against the wrong pin, confirming the note. Graves returned to her workbench, her heartbeat thundered as the bodyguard shifted forward, his hand emerging from his pocket with a slowness that telegraphed the coming storm. She clutched her shears, wondering if she had just saved a king or signed her own execution. The silence that followed Graves' warning lasted exactly 4 seconds before the air in the atelier shattered. Outside, the low hum of a marine siren wailed from the harbor, a signal she knew was the federal sting moving into position. But inside, the Viper bodyguard didn't wait for the police. Seeing the chairman rise and move toward the service lift, the guard's hand emerged from his jacket, the matte black of a silenced pistol catching the amber light. Graves didn't think, she reacted with the instinct of a woman who knew the weight and balance of every tool in her shop. As the guard leveled his aim, she hurled a heavy pair of professional shears. They didn't hit the man, but they clattered against a glass display of silk ties, the explosion of shards providing the split-second distraction Tae-O needed to vanish behind the heavy oak paneling of the service exit. The bodyguard pivoted toward Graves, his eyes cold with the realization that the Tailor was the leak. But before he could pull the trigger, the front glass of the atelier exploded inward. Federal agents in tactical gear swarmed the space, their shouts drowned out by the chaos of the harbor wind rushing into the shop. In the confusion, Graves ducked behind a heavy mahogany cutting table, her heart thundering against the floorboards as boots stomped past her hiding spot. By the time the lights were cut and the smoke cleared, the pedestal was empty. The iron anchor had slipped through their fingers. Hours later, the atelier felt like a ghost of its former self. The police had interrogated Graves for what felt like an eternity, but she played the role of the terrified immigrant perfectly. She was just a tailor, she had seen nothing but a pin slip and a sudden rush of violence. They left her in the ruins of her shop, the scent of expensive wool now replaced by the metallic tang of gunpowder and sea salt. Graves stood alone in the dark, her fingers tracing the gouge in the floor where the shears had landed. A soft, electronic chime echoed through the empty room. It wasn't her phone. The sound was coming from the velvet-lined tray on her workbench. There, sitting atop a bolt of ruined charcoal silk, was a small, heavy object that hadn't been there before the raid. She picked it up. It was a gold thimble, meticulously engraved with a single, interlocking anchor and a stylized G. It was solid, weighted with an unnatural density. As she turned it over, a microscopic green light pulsed once from the inner rim. It wasn't just a gift, it was a high-frequency GPS tracker and a panic button, a debt of honor forged in 24-karat gold. A cold shiver raced down her spine. In the underworld of Busan, Chairman Shin Tae-O didn't give gifts, he made investments. By saving the anchor, Graves had permanently woven her own life into a dangerous tapestry. She wasn't just a tailor anymore. She was a marked woman, protected by the very predator she had just saved from the cage. The gold felt heavy in her palm, a beautiful, shimmering shackle that signaled her old life was officially over. Graves tucked the thimble into her waistcoat pocket, her gaze drifting toward the dark harbor, where the real storm was just beginning to gather. The golden thimble felt like a hot coal in Graves' pocket, its weight a constant reminder that her life no longer belonged to the quiet rhythm of the needle. For 3 days, she had moved through the ruins of her atelier with the ghost-like precision of a woman who knew she was being hunted. The shattered glass had been replaced, and the scent of gunpowder had faded beneath the familiar, grounding aroma of cedar and steam, but the air remained thick with a new, suffocating tension. The police had stopped coming, but the shadows on the pier had grown teeth. Graves stood at her workbench, the evening light of Busan bleeding across the floor in long, bruised streaks of purple and orange. She was ostensibly working on a navy wool coat, but her eyes were fixed on the reflection in the polished glass of a display case. Beyond the window, where the Busan dock stretched into the dark, oily water of the harbor, a black sedan sat idling near a stack of rusted shipping containers. It had been there since dawn, a silent, predatory silhouette that didn't belong to the customs agents or the dock workers. She didn't need to see their faces to know who they were. They were the Viper's associates, the remnants of the security detail she had dismantled with a single silver pin. They weren't there to arrest her. They were waiting for the anchor to reach out to his savior so they could finish the job they had started. Graves reached into her pocket, her thumb grazing the engraved G on the thimble. She felt the faint, rhythmic pulse of the tracker, a heartbeat of gold against her skin. She was the bait in a game she hadn't asked to play, draped in the luxury of a master tailor but trapped in the crosshairs of a coastal war. Every time she looked toward the docks, she saw them, the brief flare of a cigarette in the dark, the glint of binoculars from the second story of a warehouse, the way the dock workers steered clear of the black car as if it were a leper. The isolation was the worst part. Her staff had fled, terrified by the raid, leaving her alone in a shop built for two. The silence of the atelier was so profound that she could hear the groan of the cranes outside and the distant, muffled shouts of the Jigalki market. She felt the eyes on her back, a cold pressure that made the hair on her arms stand up. They were watching her every move, waiting for her to break, waiting for her to lead them to Shin Tae-O. As the sun finally dipped below the horizon, the green light on the thimble inside her pocket pulsed twice in rapid succession, a warning, or perhaps a signal. Graves didn't flinch. She picked up her shears, the steel cool and reassuring in her hand, and began to cut into the navy wool with a steady, defiant stroke. If they were waiting for her to run, they didn't know the woman they were dealing with. She wouldn't be hunted in her own house. She would wait for the tide to turn, even if the salt air of Busan was starting to taste like a final meal. The thimble's pulse grew more insistent as the clock struck midnight, the green light vibrating through the fabric of Graves' waistcoat like a second heart. She didn't wait for a knock. She knew the rhythm of the underworld by now. When the boss called, the world simply rearranged itself to move you. A silver-gray industrial van, battered and salt-rusted to blend in with the thousands of others at the Busan port, pulled up to the curb. The black sedan across the street lurched forward to follow, but before the Viper's men could close the gap, a pair of massive logistics trucks pulled out from a side alley, perfectly timing a blockade that cut the tail off. Graves stepped into the van, her shears tucked into a hidden leather sheath at her thigh. They drove deep into the labyrinth of the Gamman container terminal, where the city's skyline was swallowed by towering walls of steel. The van stopped beside a weathered crimson shipping container isolated at the edge of a pier. When the heavy doors groaned open, Graves didn't find a cold metal box. Inside was a mobile sanctuary lined with acoustic foam, lit by soft recessed LEDs, and furnished with 2 velvet chairs and a low table holding a steaming pot of tea. Chairman Shin Tae-O sat in the shadows of the container, his charcoal suit replaced by a black silk turtleneck that made him look less like a politician and more like the predator Graves knew him to be. The air inside was pressurized, vibrating with an active noise-canceling hum that made her ears pop. "Sit, Graves," he said, his voice a low resonance that seemed to travel through the floorboards rather than the air. She sat, her posture as rigid as the seams she sewed. "The dock is crawling with them, Chairman. Your head of security left a long tail. The Viper is a nuisance I am currently exfoliating from my skin," Tae-O replied, his gaze dropping to her pocket where the thimble lay. "But we cannot speak. Not even here. The federal frequency is wide, and they have satellites over this port that can read the heat off your skin." He reached into a wooden box and pulled out a bolt of deep crimson silk, the color of arterial blood. He spread it across the table between them and handed her a piece of Tailor's chalk. "We communicate through the fabric," he commanded. "Show me what you saw on the day of the fitting. Not just the wire, but the men who stood behind it." Graves took the chalk, her fingers steady. She understood the assignment. This wasn't just a meeting, it was an interrogation of her memory and her craft. On the red silk, she began to draw the layout of her shop, marking the blind spots where the Bodyguard's associates had been positioned. She used tailoring symbols, darts for shooters, notches for exits, and heavy seam lines for police barricades. As her hand moved, Tae-O leaned in, his shoulder nearly brushing hers. The proximity was electric, a dangerous heat that had nothing to do with the humid Busan night. He watched her work, his eyes tracking the precision of her marks. When she finished the map, he took the chalk from her hand. His fingers lingered against hers for a second too long, a silent acknowledgement of the debt he owed. He drew a single, heavy circle around the Jigaoki fish market. "They think they have me cornered," he whispered, his breath ghosting against her ear. "But they've forgotten that a masterpiece is built from the inside out. You saved my life once, Graves. Now, I need you to help me cut the throat of this conspiracy." He stood, signaling the end of the meeting. As Graves stepped back out into the salt-thick air, the crimson silk was already being fed into a small shredder. She was no longer just a tailor, she was the architect of his survival, and the thread that bound them was turning a darker, more permanent shade of red. The morning air in the atelier was thick with the scent of ozone and expensive cedar, a fragile piece that vanished the moment the front locks were sheared off by a hydraulic ram. Grace didn't scream, she stood behind her cutting table, her spine as rigid as a corset stay, as Detective Park led a swarm of Busan Metropolitan Police into her sanctuary. "Where's the black ledger, Graves?" Park's voice was a low snarl, his eyes darting across the rows of pristine silk bolts. "The anchor is a ghost, but ghosts leave paper trails. We know he didn't risk the harbor sting with the records on him. He left them with the only person the feds hadn't vetted yet. You." Park didn't wait for an answer. He gestured to his team and the interrogation turned into a systematic dismantling. Graves watched, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of her mahogany table, while officers sliced open the velvet lining of her antique chairs and upended cabinets of Italian wool. Park leaned over her, his shadow swallowing her workspace. "You're a long way from the South Side, Graves. Is a man like Shin Tae-O worth a prison cell in a country that doesn't even want you here?" Graves met his flinty gaze, her voice steadied despite the hammer of her heart. "I am a tailor, detective. I handle fabric, not finances. If you're looking for a ledger, you're wasting your time and ruining some very expensive cashmere." Park's frustration boiled over. He grabbed a heavy, vintage 1940s dress form, the one Graves used for her most complex, structured coats, and shoved it toward his officers. "Check the internal supports. Tear it down." Graves' breath hitched, a microscopic reaction Park missed. Inside the hollow, reinforced chest of that mannequin, hidden behind a false floor of industrial canvas and heavy-duty stitching, lay the encrypted records of the Busan docks. She watched as an officer tipped the form over, the heavy iron base clattering against the floor. He ran a metal detector over the torso, the device chirping at the metal pins Graves had left intentionally scattered on the surface. "Just pins, sir," the officer muttered, moving on to the next display. Park leaned in closer to Graves, his face inches from hers. "He's going to get you killed. You think that gold thimble in your pocket makes you one of them? To him, you're just a thread he can snap when the garment is finished." "Maybe," Graves whispered, her eyes never wavering. "But I'm the only one who knows how to fix the seams when they burst." After 2 hours of fruitless searching, Park called the retreat. The atelier was a graveyard of ruined textiles and overturned furniture. As the last officer exited, Park turned back, pointing a gloved finger at her. "We'll be watching. One slip, Graves. One wrong stitch." Graves waited until the sound of their sirens faded into the harbor traffic before she moved. She didn't go for the mannequin. She went to the door and turned the deadbolt. Only then did she allow her hands to shake. She walked over to the fallen dress form and ran her fingers over the hidden seam in the chest. The ledger was safe, but the Viper's associates wouldn't be as restrained as the police. The authorities had lost their patience, but the underworld was about to lose its mind. The sun had barely dipped below the Busan skyline when the shadows in the alleyway behind the atelier grew teeth. Graves had just stepped out the rear exit, the weight of the gold thimble in her pocket a cold comfort, when the screech of tires echoed off the brick walls. A salt-rusted industrial van swerved into her path, cutting off her only escape. Before she could reach for the sharpened shears tucked into her thigh sheath, 3 men in tactical gear surged forward. They didn't move like the police, their movements were jagged, fueled by the desperation of a losing war. A heavy, chemical-scented bag was thrown over her head, and the world dissolved into a blur of rough canvas and the metallic tang of a van floor. When the hood was finally ripped off, Graves was strapped into a heavy wooden chair in the center of a damp warehouse. The air was thick with the rot of discarded fish and the sharp sting of ammonia. Standing before her was the Viper, the disgraced bodyguard, his face a bruised map of failure and fury. He didn't want the ledger. He wanted something far more personal. "The iron anchor thinks he's untouchable because he's wrapped in your silk," the Viper hissed, pacing the perimeter of the light. He gestured to a table where a pristine, high-collared suit sat, a perfect replica of Tae-O's signature style. Beside it lay a microscopic device, no larger than a button, shimmering with a lethal blue light. "You're going to tailor this mole suit. You're going to sew this explosive into the lining so perfectly that not even Tae-O's paranoid hands will find it when he embraces his loyal friend at tomorrow's summit." Graves looked at the device, then at the man who had betrayed his oath. "You want me to turn my craft into a coffin? I want you to finish what you started," the Viper snapped, leaning in until his breath ghosted over her skin. "If the suit isn't ready by dawn, you won't be buried in a shroud. You'll be dumped in the harbor in pieces too small to stitch back together." They untied her hands and pushed her toward a portable sewing machine set up under a single flickering bulb. The Viper's men stood guard with rifles leveled, their eyes tracking every movement of her fingers. They thought they had her cornered. They thought a woman who spent her days with thread and needles was a victim of circumstance. But as Graves picked up the replica jacket, her thumbs brushed the gold thimble in her pocket. She didn't press the panic button, not yet. She needed the Viper to think she was broken. With the steady, rhythmic hum of the machine masking her movements, she began to work. She wasn't just sewing a bomb, she was studying the tension of the room, her eyes cataloging the exit points and the rhythm of the guards' breathing. In the underworld of Busan, they viewed her as a tailor. They forgot that every master tailor is also an expert in anatomy. She knew exactly where the human body was most vulnerable, and she knew exactly how much pressure a single thread could take before it snapped. The rhythmic chug-chug of the sewing machine was the only sound in the damp warehouse, a mechanical heartbeat that Graves used to mask the frantic timing of her own. She worked with a terrifying focus, her fingers dancing over the lapel of the rigged suit. The Viper watched her from the shadows, a smug grin twisting his face as he saw her complying. He didn't notice the way her eyes flicked to the high, frosted windows or the way she kept her left foot positioned over the gold thimble in her shoe. The air in the room suddenly changed. It didn't start with a sound, but with a pressure, the same heavy, electric weight that Graves felt whenever Shin Tae-O entered her atelier. The guards sensed it too, their rifles drifting away from Graves toward the massive corrugated steel doors. "He's here," the Viper whispered, his hand going to his holster. The explosion didn't come from the doors. It came from the roof. The frosted glass shattered inward as four black-clad silhouettes rappelled down on high-tension wires. Flashbangs detonated, turning the warehouse into a blinding white void. Graves didn't scream, she dove beneath the heavy oak sewing table, her hands covering her neck. Through the ringing in her ears, she heard the rhythmic, surgical thwip-thwip of suppressed gunfire. A pair of polished black Oxfords appeared in her line of sight. They moved with a predatory grace, stepping over the crumpled form of a guard without breaking stride. A hand, scarred but familiar, reached into the darkness beneath the table. "Graves," Tae-O said. His voice was a low anchor in the chaos. "The fitting is over." He pulled her up with an effortless strength that sent a jolt of heat through her chest. Around them, the warehouse was a graveyard. The Viper was pinned against a pillar, a knife through his shoulder, his face pale with the realization that he had brought a needle to a gunfight. Tae-O didn't look at his enemies. His gaze was fixed entirely on Graves. He reached out, his thumb brushing a smudge of machine oil from her cheek. The touch was lingering, possessive, and entirely devoid of the coldness he showed the rest of Busan. "You're bleeding," he noted, his voice dropping to a dangerous frequency as he saw a small nick on her hand from the sewing needle. "It's nothing," Graves breathed, her heart finally slowing as she looked into his dark, storm-filled eyes. "I didn't finish the suit." "Good," Tae-O replied, his arm wrapping around her waist to guide her toward the armored SUV waiting in the rain. "I prefer you in my colors, not theirs." As they accelerated away from the burning warehouse and toward the neon safety of Marine City, Graves realized the dynamic had shifted forever. She wasn't just his tailor, and he wasn't just her client. They were two halves of a lethal design. In the back of the car, surrounded by the scent of rain and expensive leather, the love chapter began in earnest, not with a kiss, but with the silent, ironclad vow of two people who had decided to burn the world down together. Safely tucked away in the high-altitude silence of the Marine City penthouse, the adrenaline finally ebbed, replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. Graves didn't spend her recovery time resting, she spent it in front of the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, surrounded by the digital manifests and shipping logs Tae-O had seized from the Viper's laptop. Tae-O stood behind her, a glass of dark whiskey in his hand, watching her work. The police see a smuggling ring, Graves. My generals see a territory dispute. What do you see? Graves zoomed in on a shipping manifest from a textile mill in Milan, one she had used for years to source her finest wools. I see a pattern, she said, her voice dropping into the professional tone she used when dissecting a garment. The rival clan isn't just moving contraband, they're hiding it inside the very infrastructure I built. Look at the weight displacement on these crates of raw silk coming through Pier 7. She pointed to a microscopic discrepancy in the tear weight. To a customs agent, it was a rounding error. To a master of measurements, it was a lie. They're using my international suppliers as a shroud. They think because I'm a foreigner, I'm a blind spot. They're using the same silk routes I use for the atelier to funnel their capital out of the country. Tae-O leaned in, his chest brushing her shoulder as he studied the screen. The scent of sandalwood and expensive tobacco enveloped her. You're saying they've woven their entire treasury into your supply chain? Exactly, Graves replied, a sharp, dangerous smile tugging at her lips. They're using the foreigner's advantage. They assumed I was just a girl with a needle who didn't understand the logistics of the port. But I know the density of silk better than they know their own mothers. If we pull this specific thread, this supplier in Milan, their entire financial structure unspools. Tae-O's hand rested on the table next to hers, his fingers inches from her own. You've done more in one night with a laptop than my men have done in a year with explosives. You aren't just reading the fabric of a suit anymore, Graves. You're reading the geography of this war. He turned to her, his gaze intense enough to burn. They underestimated you because you are an outsider. That was their final mistake. Graves felt a surge of something more potent than pride. For the first time since landing in Busan, she didn't feel like a guest or a target. She felt like an architect. By using her unique perspective, she had found the loose thread in the rival clan's armor. Now, all they had to do was pull. The summer monsoon turned the Busan sky into a bruised sheet of gray, drenching the Jigalki fish market in a relentless, vertical downpour. The air was a thick soup of salt, diesel, and the metallic tang of blood from the morning's catch. This was the heart of the city, a labyrinth of narrow alleys, steaming vats of boiling shellfish, and hanging nets that acted like curtains in a theater of war. Graves sat in the back of a nondescript delivery truck parked on a ridge overlooking the market, her face illuminated by the cold blue glow of 3 tactical monitors. She wore her headset with the same precision she used for her measuring tape. Below, Tae-O moved through the crowd, a shadow in a navy wool coat Graves had reinforced with ultra-thin Kevlar, a masterpiece designed to save his life a second time. Status, Graves? Tae-O's voice crackled in her ear, steady despite the chaos around him. The loose thread is moving, Graves replied, her eyes tracking a heat signature on her screen. 3 o'clock, behind the ice crates. He's wearing a yellow slicker, but his gait is too heavy for a dock worker. That's your shooter. Tae-O didn't turn his head. He navigated the market's blind spots with a lethal grace, guided by Graves' voice. She was his eyes in the storm, using the market's own textures, the rising steam from the food stalls and the heavy hanging tarps, to hide him from the rival clan snipers. Wait, Graves whispered, her heart skipping a beat. The rhythm of the crowd is changing. They're closing the circle. Tae-O, move left toward the red awning. Now. As Tae-O pivoted, a hail of suppressed gunfire shredded the wooden crates where he had stood seconds before. The market erupted into a choreographed nightmare. Graves didn't panic, she leaned into the data. She saw the patterns in the violence, the way the rival clan's men moved in clumsy, wide arcs while Tae-O moved in the tight, efficient lines Graves had mapped out for him on the Crimson Silk Bolt nights before. Graves, I'm pinned at the central fountain, Tae-O grunted. The sound of heavy caliber fire echoed through the comms. I see them. Two shooters on the catwalk above the king crab tanks, Graves directed, her fingers flying across the keyboard to activate the market's industrial misting system. I'm blinding them. When the steam hits, move 45 degrees to your right. There's a service hatch under the floorboards. A thick, white cloud of artificial fog swallowed the fountain. In the confusion, Tae-O vanished. Moments later, he reappeared behind the lead assassin. The struggle was brief and decisive. By the time the rain began to let up, the Jigalki ambush was over. The rival clan had expected a cornered animal. They found a predator guided by a strategist who understood the anatomy of a trap. Tae-O stood over the fallen shooters, his navy coat darkened by the rain but unbreached. He looked up toward the ridge where Graves was hidden. He didn't wave, but he touched the lapel of the suit she had made him, a silent salute to the woman who had turned a fish market into his personal killing floor. The thread is pulled, Graves, he said into the mic. Let's go home. The aftermath of the Jigalki ambush left the underworld in a state of fractured silence. The rival clan had been decapitated, but the true danger remained within Tae-O's own ranks, the silent partners who had funded the Viper's betrayal. To flush them out, Tae-O summoned the council to the penthouse for a unification fitting. Graves stood in the center of the lounge, her posture regal, draped in a charcoal gray vest that matched the steel in her eyes. On the table before her lay her tools, a silver measuring tape, a box of blackened steel pins, and a bolt of silk so dark it seemed to swallow the light. One by one, the remaining lieutenants stepped onto the pedestal. They were powerful men, architects of Busan's black markets, but as Graves moved around them, they were reduced to mere measurements. She was no longer just a tailor, she was a judge. Hold still, Mr. Kong, Graves murmured, her voice like velvet-wrapped wire. She wrapped the tape around his chest, tightening it just a fraction too much. As she worked, she wasn't just measuring shoulders. With the precision of a surgeon, she was planting microscopic, high-frequency transmitters into the heavy padding of their shoulder pads, devices disguised as standard tailoring weights. She also brushed a clear, ultraviolet chemical marker onto the cuffs of the men she had identified through the shipping manifests. By the time she was done, every trader in the room was tagged for the final cut. The tension in the room was suffocating. The men looked at Tae-O, who sat in the shadow sipping whiskey, then at Graves, the woman who had become the anchor's shadow. They didn't see the strategist, they saw a servant. It was the last mistake they would ever make. When the final man stepped down, Tae-O rose. He walked over to Graves, his hand resting possessively on her shoulder. The touch was no longer professional, it was a public declaration of her status within the inner circle. The suits will be ready for the gala tomorrow night, Graves announced, her gaze sweeping the room. I've ensured they fit you, perfectly. As the men filed out, Tae-O turned to her. He didn't speak, but he took her hand, his thumb tracing the gold thimble she still wore. In the silence of the penthouse, the love chapter deepened. The distance between them, once measured in social standing and language barriers, had vanished, replaced by a lethal, shared intimacy. They were no longer two people caught in a storm, they were the storm itself. The Busan Opera House was a cathedral of gold leaf and crimson velvet, a setting where the city's elite came to see a performance, unaware that they were the lead actors in a tragedy. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the underlying, metallic tension of a coming storm. Graves stood on the mezzanine, looking down at the ballroom floor. Below, the remaining council members, the men who had secretly funded the Viper's coup, moved through the crowd with a newfound, arrogant confidence. They were all wearing their Graze originals, the bespoke suits she had fitted them for just days prior. To them, the heavy, structured wool was a symbol of their rising status in the wake of the anchor's perceived weakness. Tae-O stood beside her, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. He was a shadow in a tuxedo of such deep midnight blue it appeared black under the chandeliers. "Are the scenes tight enough, Graves?" he whispered, his eyes never leaving the targets below. "They're exactly where they need to be," Graves replied, her voice steady. She hadn't just planted microphones, she had engineered a psychological trap. The suits were cut with a specific, subtle flaw. The armholes were slightly too high, the chest panels reinforced with a stiffening agent that made the wearers feel a constant, phantom pressure against their lungs. It was a tailoring trick designed to induce a state of low-level anxiety, making the traders twitchy and prone to mistakes. As the orchestra reached the crescendo of the overture, Graves tapped a final command into her tablet. The massive digital displays flanking the stage, meant to show the night's program, flickered and changed. The audio of their private meetings, recorded by the conductive thread woven into their lapels, began to play over the house speakers. Their own voices, cold and treacherous, filled the ballroom. The council members froze, their hands instinctively flying to the very suits that were now betraying them. Suddenly, the house lights dimmed, replaced by high-intensity ultraviolet spotlights. The chemical markers Graves had brushed onto the traders' cuffs and lapels glowed a brilliant, neon blue. They stood out in the crowd like glowing ghosts, exposed to every guest in the building. The panic was immediate. The men who had thought they were the architects of a new order were now the center of a public execution. They tried to tear the jackets off, but Graves had used reinforced security stitching on the buttons. They wouldn't budge without a blade. They were trapped in the very luxury they had craved. Tae-O didn't move to arrest them. He didn't need to. In the underworld of Busan, exposure was the same as a death sentence. The city's other power players, seeing the tide turn so decisively, pulled away from the glowing men as if they were lepers. By the time the security teams moved in to escort the traders out, the council had already collapsed. Grace watched the fallout with a calm, professional detachment. She had used her craft to dismantle an empire, proving that a needle could be as lethal as a knife if handled by the right hand. Tae-O turned to her, the light from the chandeliers glinting in his dark eyes. He didn't say thank you, he didn't have to. He simply took her hand and led her away from the mezzanine, toward the private balcony overlooking the harbor. The final cut had been made, and the garment of their new life was finally ready for its debut. The salt air of the Busan harbor felt different tonight, less like a shroud and more like a fresh start. Graves stood on the edge of the private pier in Marine City, the towering glass monoliths of the skyline reflecting off the black water like jagged diamonds. The chaos of the opera house was hours behind them, but the silence between her and Tae-O felt just as heavy, though far more intimate. Tae-O stepped up beside her, the wind ruffling his hair for the first time since she had met him. The iron anchor looked human in the moonlight, his armor stripped away by the victory they had shared. He reached into his pocket and produced a small, velvet-lined box. Inside sat a set of keys, heavy and cool, made of the same brushed steel as her favorite shears. "The building on the North Pier," he said, his voice a low vibration in the night air. "It was a warehouse for the rival clan's silk. Now, it is titled in your name. 3 floors of glass, a private dock, and enough room for the finest atelier in Asia." Graves took the keys, her fingers brushing his. "You're giving me an empire, Tae-O. But empires require more than just a beautiful building." "It's not just a shop, Graves," he replied, turning to face her. The intensity in his gaze was no longer that of a client or a protector, it was the look of a man who had found his equal. The world thinks you are a tailor who happened to save a king. They don't realize you are the one who drafted the pattern for the king's survival. I don't want a servant. I want an architect. Grace looked at the keys, then back at the man who had changed the trajectory of her life. She had come to Busan as an outsider, a Black American woman trying to weave her way into a closed society through sheer technical skill. She had expected to be invisible. Instead, she had become indispensable. A master tailor knows that the most beautiful garments are the ones with a hidden structure, Graves whispered, stepping closer until the heat from his body warded off the coastal chill. We've built something very strong, Tae-O. But don't expect me to always follow your design. Tae-O leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. A rare, genuine smile broke his predator's mask. I wouldn't have it any other way. As the first light of dawn began to touch the horizon, Graves realized her old life had officially been cut away, discarded like a scrap of waste fabric. She was no longer just a tailor in a foreign land. She was Graves Solomon, the silent heart of the Busan underworld. Thank you for sticking to this story till the end.